Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is David Jackson, a professor of Portuguese at Yale University. His research interests include Portuguese and Brazilian literatures, Camões, Machado de Assis, Fernando Pessoa, modernist, vanguardist, and inter-arts literature, Portuguese culture in Asia, and ethnomusicology. Today we'll talk with Professor Jackson about his new book entitled Machado de Assis, A Literary Life. Welcome, Professor Jackson.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's start by having you tell us who this man was. Who is Machado?
Machado de Assis is Brazil's greatest writer and all of Latin America's greatest writer in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. He had a very long literary life, a formative period of some 25 years where he wrote journalism, translated plays, was very active in Rio de Janeiro, and then the last 30 years where he produced the novels for which and short stories for which he's most known. He was a man of letters in every sense. He wrote in practically every genre: novel, short story, play, journalism. He did translations of Victor Hugo, of Shakespeare, and he became the preeminent man of letters of his time in Brazil. And his novels then are considered now some of the great novels of the end of the 19th century.
Okay, and tell us about your book and what your goal was in writing it.
So the goal of my book was to promote Machado and present Machado as a great writer of his time in the company of the other European and world prose writers of the end of the 19th century.
And what were some of his contemporaries at that point?
So he's mentioned along with Henry James, with Proust, with Dostoevsky, Gogol, and of course in the Iberian Peninsula with Essa de Queiroz and some of the other great prose writers. He had translated Dickens, so he really fits in to the great realist writers of the end of the 19th century, except that he changed that whole tradition, and he can be seen, and one of the objects of my book is to present him as, in a way, the inventor of the modernist novel and modernist prose.
Okay. Very interesting.
So this he did by changing a received tradition. He was a great reader. He read everything. And his works incorporate, shall I say, traces of everything that he read, but they're changed to be applied to a Brazilian situation and also put across with his characteristic humor and irony and his narrative stance.
Now, I know you're a big fan, and I'm curious, what specifically was it about Machado that drew you to him?
I think he's the first author I read when I started studying Portuguese, and the fascination stayed with me. And of course, I've taken a number of seminars and continue to read Machado over the years. But his novels are so ingenious in a way that they're sort of prime material that people who do Portuguese study. Our acquaintance with Machado de Assis through translation actually had an early phase in the 1950s and 60s. A classical scholar at UCLA named Helen Caldwell translated 3 of his novels and a number of short stories and did 2 books of interpretation published in 1960 and 1970. William Grossman, another translator, did the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, which is an early novel in an early edition. And these were, to some extent, widely read at the time. I had a Yale alumnus who returned to take a course with me after he had graduated, and he had read these translations in the 60s and thought it was so unusual to have a course available on Machado de Assis that he came to read them again. Now we've come to another cycle. There are new translations of a lot of the major novels in the Oxford Latin American Library, and there's been quite a lot of renewed attention to Machado de Assis. I think the prominence of Brazil in recent news has helped to promote that. And also there are a number of online sites where you can access the complete works of Machado and studies of him as well. So that now there's a new attention to Machado de Assis. And our own Harold Bloom, of course, has mentioned Machado as one of the great authors of the Western tradition. And part of the objective of my book also is to promote the incorporation of Machado into the courses of comparative literature and into the canon, let's say, of the world's major authors.
So if we had to pick one of his works, for instance, a novel perhaps, give us a bit of detail about it, an overview.
So yes, he wrote 4 early novels in the 1870s that are considered romantic, but they actually do have many characteristics of what's called his mature fiction. And that consists of 5 novels starting in 1880 with the posthumous memoirs of Brás Cubas, which has the interesting conceit that the author has written the book after death. Right? Then there's an interesting discussion among readers of Machado whether that's his greatest novel or whether it's Dom Casmurro, which is a novel he wrote in 1900, which is the retrospective memoirs of another character. So those 2 are generally considered his greatest novels. He also wrote Quincas Borba, a novel in 1890, which is sort of a continuation of the first, and 2 final novels written in the 20th century by a character named Conselheiro Aires. The interesting thing about all of these novels, which is also fascinating for readers, is that they're not written by Machado de Assis. They're written by the main characters, who are the narrators of their own memoirs, and generally written either retrospectively at a point in old age or in the first one after death. So we have Brás Cubas, who's dead and writing his memoirs. We have Bento Santiago, who's an old man recalling the incidents of his earlier life and justifying them. And we have Councillor Aires, who's a retired diplomat who comes back to Rio after a long career to face death, but to interact with the city of his memory.
Okay, very interesting. So Machado has a very large body of work, and also many have written about him as well. How did you go about doing the research for your book?
So the bibliography on Machado, of course mostly in Portuguese, is immense. There's a 1955 work of bibliography on Machado, which is an enormous volume. So fortunately the Yale Library is pretty good, so I was able to find a number of crucial interpretations of Machado. But that was the question, how to approach Machado now in view of all of the books written about him over time, really from the 30s to the present. So actually I found several accounts to be very useful. One of a curious Brazilian scholar named Agrippino Greco, who knew all of Machado's sources. This is a time when people read everything. There's no TV. So he says, oh, this is from here and there. And he even makes a curious comment when he says, I wish I had read Machado when I was much younger, because then I wouldn't know any of this, and it would all seem fresh and direct. So that was a help to me in showing how Machado had pieced together sources from everything that he read from different literatures, classical sources, history, and so forth, to compile his diverse narratives and his style.
So earlier you had mentioned that he's becoming more popular. Up until this point, I think he's been relatively unknown, even though there is such a huge volume of writing about him. Why do you think it is? Is his works translated into English, for instance?
So that's an interesting question, because after Helen Caldwell, there were a number of American critics who discovered Machado de Assis. Susan Sontag wrote a long essay in the New Yorker that became very well known. Michael Wood at Princeton. John Barth, the author, mentioned a lot of Machado. And Woody Allen, right, comments on Machado de Assis. So it's not that he's unknown, but I would say that he was lesser read. And when these translations came out, they wouldn't necessarily stay in print. And I think part of the problem, and this is pointing out, is that there wasn't enough criticism. There wasn't enough writing about Machado that was available for people to know more about him other than just the translations that were on the market. So I think we still need books about Machado de Assis and interpretations of Machado as a way of helping students and other readers to be able to fully appreciate the works that are now in translation before them.
All right, and in his writing, he employed a number of key principles. Let's talk a little bit about that.
So one of the things that's most modern about his novels is his narrative strategy and his talking to the reader. So we assume most of his readers at the time were female readers in Rio, and he humorously dialogues with them.
So it was mostly
there was a very small literate class at the time, and this was the Brazilian Empire. So there wasn't that amount of literature in Brazil at the time. So he's very aware that his readers may be, of course, female readers at home from this class, and he teases them, plays with them to a large extent, and will say, oh, as my reader knows, and then he'll say, the reader who remembers chapter 2 will know that, so you have to go back to chapter 2. And at one point, Bras Cubas accuses the reader and says, the greatest defect of my book is you, reader, right? You're the one who's keeping my book from being everything it should be. So the dialogue with the reader is very important, and it makes the reader then part of the process of the actual construction or reading of the book. And that's one of his most innovative narrative features. The other is using small chapters, some of which are put together only with graphic signs. So he's quite experimental and inventive to that extent. There's one chapter that's just an epitaph on a tombstone. In other words, he's one of the first authors to use a kind of, what shall I say, multimedia, different narrative structure, semiotic approach to putting the novel together.
Okay. And then conclusions. What do you conclude in the book?
What I conclude in the book. Machado worked a lot with theater in his early life. He was very impressed with the great actresses and actors who came to Brazil. There were Italian Shakespearean actors who came in the 1870s. There were great sopranos who sang with the operas, mostly Italian, that were produced in Brazil, and really quite soon after their premieres in Italy. And actually, one of the points I make is that the great heroines in Machado's novels, he created great female characters, are based to a certain extent probably on these famous sopranos whom he saw and wrote about in Brazil. But to a certain extent, he constructs in his novel a theater of the world, which is the city of Rio de Janeiro of his time, the world of the empire, as if it were to a certain extent an opera on stage, right? So that opera techniques of recitative, of dialogue, of scenes and so forth, really I think help to form and sustain his literary works. So my last conclusion, or my chapter, is called Machado and the Spectacle of the World, which is the idea of the author who's the observer of the very theatrical performance of the world of Rio de Janeiro that he constructs. And like a number of other famous authors, he never left the city of Rio de Janeiro practically. So the city was, to a certain extent, his a universe that he knew very well.
And if one wanted to get their feet wet for the first time with Machado, what would you suggest they read? So
there have been a number of new translations of his short stories. He was a master of the short story. And so the translations in English start with The Devil's Church, A Chapter of Hats. There are a number of new volumes of short stories. That would be a very good place to start. Or some of the latest translations of his novels. I would say the posthumous memoirs of Bras Cubas or Dom Casmurro, very famous works and open to different kinds of interpretations, so the reader could jump right in and then try to figure out what's going on.
Very exciting, David. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
And sharing some of your work. Very good. For more information about Professor Jackson and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.